My life before the house was a study in muted tones. A small apartment, the drone of city traffic, a constant, dull thrum against the thin glass of my window. Days bled into weeks, each indistinguishable from the last. My routines were rigid, a desperate attempt to impose order on an existence that felt increasingly untethered. There was no one to miss me when I worked late, no one to notice the dust gathering on my bookshelves, no one to share the quiet meals I ate alone. I was a ghost in my own life, transparent and unnoticed. I wanted a change, a rupture, anything to break the monotonous cycle that was slowly, imperceptibly suffocating me. Then the letter arrived, thick cream-colored stationery, smelling faintly of old paper and something metallic, like a forgotten coin. It was from a solicitor I'd never heard of, informing me of an inheritance, an ancestral home in a place so remote, so utterly forgotten, it barely registered on modern maps. My great-aunt, a woman I'd only met once as a child, had passed, leaving me everything. The decision was swift, almost impulsive. It wasn't about the money, there wasn't much. The solicitor had made that clear, mostly property taxes and upkeep. It was the solitude, the promise of a fresh start, a canvas wiped clean. A place where I could breathe, or so I hoped. I sold what little furniture I owned, packed a few boxes of essentials, and left the city without a backward glance. The journey was long, miles blurring into a monotonous stretch of asphalt, then gravel, then finally, a narrow, winding track barely wide enough for my vehicle. Trees, skeletal and gnarled, clawed at the sky on either side, their branches interwoven to form a perpetual twilight tunnel. The house loomed abruptly from the dense foliage, a monolithic shadow against the bruised evening sky. It wasn't grand in the way of stately manners, but imposing certainly. 3 stories of weathered stone and dark timber, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from under heavy, moss-laden brows. A sagging porch, once perhaps welcoming, now seemed to frown, its railings splintered like broken teeth. The air grew heavy the closer I got, thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something I couldn't quite place, a faint, metallic tang, like old blood. Or rust. The front door, a heavy slab of oak, groaned in protest as I pushed it open. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak sunlight that pierced the grimy panes, illuminating a grand, yet neglected, entryway. Off, my initial explorations were methodical, driven by a determined practicality. I needed to assess the damage, find a working outlet, locate the water main. The ground floor revealed a sprawling layout, a vast living room, a formal dining room, a kitchen with a massive, defunct hearth. Each room was a monument to a forgotten past, draped in white sheets that billowed slightly as I passed, like sleeping giants. The floorboards, despite their age, held firm under my weight, though every step elicited a chorus of creaks and groans that seemed to follow me. Upstairs, the bedrooms were equally vast, equally desolate. I chose the smallest one, at the back of the house, overlooking a tangled, overgrown garden. It felt less exposed. As I arranged my books on a dusty shelf, a sudden icy draft swept through the room. I shivered, pulling my worn jacket tighter. I checked the window, it was latched shut, the glass unmoving. I dismissed it as an old house settling, a trick of the air currents. Later, as twilight deepened, painting the window panes in shades of bruised violet, I lit a few candles. I was in the main living room, attempting to clear a small space by the fireplace, when I heard it. A faint scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across stone, coming from somewhere below. I froze, my hand hovering over a dusty armchair. The sound was too subtle to be rats, too deliberate for the house's usual groans. My breath hitched. I told myself it was the wind, perhaps a branch scraping against the stone foundation. Yet the air was still heavy. A prickle of unease started to spread across my skin. I tried to rationalize it away. Old houses made strange noises. The isolation was getting to me. But then, as I turned to fetch another candle, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. It was gone before I could properly register it, leaving only the impression of something swift and formless. My heart gave a lurch, a frantic drum against my ribs. I spun around, staring into the empty hallway. Nothing, just the vast, echoing space. My mind raced, searching for a logical explanation. A trick of the candlelight, perhaps. My eyes playing tricks in the dim light. Still nothing. Not just by the house, but by something within it. I walked to the kitchen entrance, peering into the inky blackness. My determination, usually a sturdy shield, wavered. I told myself it was simply the strangeness of a new place, the overwhelming quiet after years of city noise. But as I retreated back to the relative light of the living room, my gaze fell upon a heavy, iron-bound door set into the floorboards near the unused pantry. It was flush with the wood, almost invisible, secured by a massive, rusted padlock. It looked ancient, forgotten, an anomaly, and I, user Ag, was now undeniably trapped within its vast, unsettling embrace. The silence of the house, initially a balm, began to curdle. My routines were rigid, a desperate attempt to impose order on an existence that felt increasingly out of my control. This house, this sprawling, forgotten monument to my family's past, was meant to be different, a new canvas, a fresh start. I had come here to reclaim a sense of agency, to build something tangible from the wreckage of my former life. My determination was a shield, a stubborn refusal to let the dust and decay win. I started small, tackling the kitchen first, stripping away decades of grime, scrubbing surfaces until they gleamed. The rhythmic scrape of brush against tile, a soothing counterpoint to the house's deeper, less definable sounds. That's when it began, a faint, almost imperceptible shift. I'd placed a small ceramic mug on the counter, its handle facing the sink. When I turned back from the pantry, it had rotated, just a fraction of an inch, the handle now angled towards the wall. My breath hitched. I stared, then laughed, a short, sharp sound that felt too loud in the cavernous space. Settling. I told myself, the old floorboards, the vibrations of my own movement. I nudged it back into place, a defiant gesture. The next morning, the smell came first. Not the usual must of an old house, but something else entirely. A cloying sweetness like overripe fruit left to rot, overlaid with a metallic tang that made the back of my throat itch. I scoured the kitchen, convinced I'd missed a forgotten pantry item. Nothing. The scent was pervasive, stronger near the cellar door, which I kept firmly shut. My logical mind kicked in. Mold, a dead animal in the walls, the drainage system. I pulled on an old work shirt, grabbed a flashlight, and descended into the cellar. The air down there was heavy, stagnant. Dust motes danced in the beam of my light, swirling like miniature galaxies. The smell intensified, thick and sickening. I checked the pipes, ran a hand along the damp stone walls, peered into dark corners. Nothing obvious. But then a sound. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a low, guttural murmur, a suggestion of something vocal. My heart gave a startled thud. Rats, I decided, my voice louder than intended, the sound echoing back at me, or the wind rattling some loose stone. I tapped the wall, testing its solidity, but one section lower down felt different, a slight give. I spent the rest of the day with a crowbar and a headlamp prying at the loose stones. The mortar crumbled easily, like dry biscuit. Not a natural cave, but a crudely constructed archway leading into absolute blackness. An underground tunnel system. My breath caught. This wasn't on any survey of the house, nor in the old deeds. My initial thought was relief. This was it. This must be the source of the smells, the strange echoes, an old forgotten access, perhaps part of a forgotten utility or even smuggling route. My determination resurfaced. Eager to conquer this new mystery, I would explore it, clean it, seal it off if necessary. The metallic sweet smell was overwhelming here, making my stomach churn. I moved slowly, my light sweeping across the rough-hewn walls, the packed earth floor. The passage twisted and turned, damp and claustrophobic. My logical brain, however, was still fighting. The acoustics are strange down here. Then the floor shifted beneath my foot. Not a collapse, but a subtle, almost organic ripple. I froze, my light beam shaking. A low, wet chuckle seemed to emanate from the very air around me, closer this time, distinct from the general hum. It was deep, resonant, and utterly devoid of mirth. My rationalizations shattered. This wasn't a draft. This wasn't an old house settling. This wasn't rats or bad plumbing or my own overactive imagination. The smell wasn't just decay, it was a presence. I backed out of the tunnel, my retreat clumsy. My heart racing. I scrambled through the makeshift opening, my hands scraping against the rough stone. The cellar suddenly felt safer, despite its own lingering stench. I slammed the loose stones back into place, a futile gesture against something I couldn't comprehend. The house, once a symbol of my new beginning, had become a cage, and I, user Ag, was trapped within its unsettling reality. My rigid order, my careful routines, they were all useless now. My routines, once a rigid framework against the chaos of the world, were rippling, then tearing. The house had begun to unravel them, thread by thread. I tried to re-establish some semblance of order, to convince myself that the drafts, the creaks, the subtle shifts in the air were just the quirks of an old structure. I'd wake at dawn, make coffee, and attempt to read in the dusty parlor, the morning light slicing through grimy windows. But the words blurred, my gaze drifting to the shadows that seemed to pool in corners, even in broad daylight, or to the way the floorboards sighed under an unseen weight. The whispers had grown bolder, no longer just a trick of the wind. They were like dry leaves skittering across a parched floor, just at the edge of hearing, always when I was alone. They never formed words I could discern, just a ceaseless, sibilant murmur that scraped at the edges of my sanity. Sometimes I'd catch a faint, cloying scent, not decay, not dust, but something sickly sweet, like overripe fruit left too long in the sun, or a forgotten flower pressed into a book. It would bloom in a room, hang heavy in the air, then vanish as quickly as it came, leaving me to question if I'd imagined it. I spent my days in a state of hyper-awareness, every nerve ending frayed. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the distant chirping of crickets outside these normal sounds, now felt like intrusions, like static trying to drown out something vital I needed to hear. I found myself checking locks multiple times, peering out windows, though I knew there was no one else for miles. It wasn't intruders I feared anymore. It was the house itself. One afternoon, I was in the library, attempting to catalog the haphazard collection of ancient, leather-bound volumes. The air was still, thick with the smell of old paper and dust. I pulled a particularly heavy tome from a high shelf. Its pages brittle, its cover embossed with a strange, twisting symbol I didn't recognize. As I set it on the table, a low, resonant groan emanated from the floorboards beneath my feet. It wasn't the usual settling creak. This was deeper, a sound of immense strain, as if the very foundations of the house were protesting. My head snapped up. Across the room, an antique grandfather clock, a silent sentinel I'd barely noticed until then, began to chime. Not the gentle, measured toll of the hour, but a frantic, discordant cascade of bells, each strike louder, more jarring than the last. The pendulum swung wildly, far beyond its normal arc, slamming against the wooden casing with violent thuds. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The chimes grew deafening, a maddening symphony of metallic shrieks. Then, with a groan that echoed the one from the floor, the clock's heavy wooden door burst open, tearing off its hinges and crashing to the floor. I stood frozen, my eyes wide, my throat constricted. This wasn't a draft. This wasn't old house noises. The room began to vibrate, not a gentle tremor, but a violent shudder that shook the very ground I stood on. Books leaped from shelves, not sliding but flying with unnatural force, pages fluttering like panicked birds. A heavy, ornate mirror, bolted to the wall above the fireplace, suddenly tore free, ripping a chunk of plaster with it. It hung suspended for a terrifying moment, the glass reflecting my own horrified face before it smashed to the ground, exploding into 1,000 glittering shards. The cacophony was overwhelming, splintering wood, shattering glass, the relentless, discordant clang of the clock. A low, guttural growl seemed to fill the air, not from an animal, but from something vast and unseen, something that resonated in my very bones. When I dared to open them again, the room was still, save for the slow, agonizing tick-tock of the broken clock. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, stumbling towards the shattered mirror. The growl, the flying books, the clock, it had all been too real, too violent to dismiss. My mind, which had clung so desperately to rational explanations, now surrendered to a primal, bone-deep fear. It was here, it was real, and it was actively hostile. As I stared at the jagged remnants of the mirror, something else caught my eye. A desperate need for answers seized me, overriding the paralyzing fear. I couldn't stay here, not with this entity making its presence so violently known. I had to understand what it was, what it wanted. This house was a trap, but perhaps this passage was an escape, or at least a way to uncover the truth. My hand trembled, but my resolve hardened. I had nowhere else to go, nowhere to run. The opening was just wide enough for me to squeeze through. The passage sloped downwards, the walls rough-hewn rock and packed earth, slick with moisture. The beam of my phone danced ahead, illuminating a claustrophobic tunnel system. My breath hitched. This was no cellar. This was something ancient, something deliberately hidden. The floor was uneven, strewn with loose rocks and what felt like slick mud. Water dripped somewhere nearby, a monotonous plink, plink, plink that echoed unnervingly in the confined space. The sickly sweet smell intensified, now tinged with the metallic tang of damp earth and something else, something indescribably old and stagnant. I tried to re-establish some semblance of order, to convince myself that the drafts, the creaks, the subtle shifts in the air were just the quirks of an ancient structure, but the conviction had worn thin. It wasn't just the house itself anymore. It was the way it seemed to respond to my presence, the way the silence sometimes felt like a held breath, waiting. I was no longer merely living in this place, I was being observed. The quiet solitude I'd sought felt less like peace and more like a trap. The shadows in the corners deepened not with the setting sun, but with the mounting weight of my own unease. I found myself scrutinizing every detail, every warped floorboard, every discolored patch of wallpaper. The house, in its decrepit grandeur, felt less like an inheritance and more like a puzzle box, its secrets guarded by dust and decay. My determination, however, had not yet crumbled. If this house held answers, I would find them. Rows of forgotten tomes lined shelves that bowed under their weight, their spines cracked, their pages brittle. The air here was thick with the scent of aged paper and something else, something faintly metallic, like old blood or perhaps just rust. I ran my hand along the wooden panels, feeling for loose sections, for hidden catches. My fingers snagged on a raised knot in the oak paneling behind a particularly heavy set of encyclopedias. I pressed, and with a soft click, a narrow, almost invisible seam appeared. Behind the panel, not a safe, but a small, recessed cavity, barely large enough for a single leather-bound journal. It was thick with dust, the leather dry and flaking beneath my touch. No name graced its cover. Only a single, crudely etched symbol, a jagged, incomplete circle with 3 radiating lines. A shiver traced its way down my spine. This felt less like a discovery and more like an unearthing. I carried the journal to the sturdy oak table in the dining room, the one place where the light still felt somewhat honest. The first pages were filled with mundane entries, a chronicle of daily life from a century ago, weather observations, notes on crop yields, the occasional mention of a neighbor. Then the tone shifted. The handwriting, once neat and precise, became erratic, sprawling. Dates grew further apart. They speak of the land, the roots, the hunger beneath. It demands sustenance. It demands acknowledgement. My breath hitched. I wasn't alone in hearing them then. This wasn't just madness. It was a chronicle of something deliberate, something summoned. The journal entries spoke of a tragic event, veiled in euphemisms but clear enough. The sacrifice was made, the pact sealed, the hunger temporarily sated but never truly gone. A family member unnamed had departed into the earth, not died, not passed away, departed into the earth. The words painted a vivid, horrifying picture in my mind, a ritualistic disappearance. Towards the back, amidst frantic scribbles and arcane symbols I couldn't decipher, was a crude map. It wasn't of the house itself, but of the grounds, with a prominent, heavily marked X near the oldest part of the property, beneath what appeared to be the crumbling foundation of an old outbuilding. The journal dropped from my trembling fingers, scattering dust across the polished wood. This wasn't just a house, it was a mausoleum, a cage built around a terrible secret. The entity, whatever it was, wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real, it had been here before, and it was awake. I found the entrance where the map indicated, hidden beneath a collapsed shed, disguised by overgrown brambles and loose stones. A small, rusted iron ladder descended into blackness. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to flee this accursed place, but the determination that had driven me to this point held firm. I had to know. I had to understand what I was up against. Climbing down, the air grew heavy, thick with moisture, and the metallic tang I'd noticed in the library. The passage was claustrophobic, barely wide enough for my shoulders in places, forcing me to move slowly, deliberately. The underground tunnel system was a labyrinth, winding and branching. Each turn felt like a descent deeper into the earth, deeper into the house's buried malevolence. My breath plumed in the cold air. The journal's words echoed in my mind, the hunger beneath. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a small, circular chamber. The air here was even heavier, charged with a palpable stillness that prickled my skin. My flashlight beam swept across the walls, revealing crude etchings, the same jagged symbol from the journal cover, repeated over and over, alongside other, more complex sigils. In the center of the chamber, a large, flat stone, slick with moisture, served as a grim altar. Around it, faint traces of dried substances, herbs, perhaps, or something far more disturbing clung to the floor. Tucked into a crevice in the wall, I found a final, brittle parchment. It was a single page, written in the same frantic hand, dated years after the journal's last entry. It detailed the entity's nature with horrifying clarity. It feeds on the very essence of life, on fear, on regret, on the despair of the trapped. It cannot be killed, only appeased or bound. But the binding weakens with time, and the hunger returns. The malevolent entity, long dormant, was awake. It had been awakened by my presence, drawn by my isolation, my fear, my regret over the life I'd left behind. This house wasn't just a home, it was a trap, and I, user Ag, was its newest occupant, destined to be its next offering. The air in the chamber pressed in, suffocating, as if something vast and invisible had just inhaled. I was no longer an investigator. I was prey. My flashlight beam trembled, casting dancing shadows across the ancient symbols. And I felt it then, a cold, seeping certainty that settled in my bones. This house wasn't just a home, it was a trap, and I, user Ag, was caught. The air in the underground tunnel system hung heavy, tasting of damp earth and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old, forgotten blood. The rough-hewn stone walls, slick with condensation, pressed in on me. My breath plumed in the frigid air. I could hear the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere deeper in the dark, an endless, maddening rhythm that echoed the frantic beat of my own heart. The symbols, now so clear in their intent, seemed to pulse faintly in the periphery of my vision, even when my beam wasn't directly on them. They were binding glyphs, I realized, not warnings. They were meant to contain, yes, but also to draw. A tremor ran through the stone floor beneath my boots, a low thrumming that resonated in my chest. Not an earthquake, I knew. This was something else. This was the house itself, or what lay within it, responding. It felt like a deep, guttural sigh exhaled from the very foundations of the earth. I had to get out. The thought was a desperate, clawing thing, overriding the creeping paralysis. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping back along the path I'd taken. The tunnel stretched back, seemingly identical to the way ahead, a more of absolute blackness. I started walking, then jogging, then an uncontrolled scramble, my boots skidding on the damp floor. The air grew thicker, heavier, clinging to my skin like a shroud. I could feel eyes on me, not just a sense of being watched, but a palpable pressure on the back of my neck, a prickling along my scalp. Hello? It was not a language I recognized, but the tone was unmistakable, a low, predatory hiss, laced with a mocking amusement. I would not succumb. I would find a way out. I stumbled upon what looked like a collapsed section, rubble piled high, blocking the path. Despair threatened to drown me, but then I saw it, a narrow gap, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. Hope, a fragile, desperate thing, flared. I pushed my way through the jagged opening, scraping my arms and tearing my clothes. The passage on the other side was narrower, steeper, sloping upwards. I could feel a faint draft, air that smelled less of earth and more of the decaying leaves of the outside world. I clawed my way up, my fingers finding purchase on damp roots that snaked through the stone. Finally, I pushed through a curtain of thick ivy and emerged into the moonlit night. Freedom. The cool night air on my face was a shock, a blessing. My lungs burned, but I gulped in the air, tasting the faint metallic tang of rain on the horizon. I looked back at the house, a shiver running down my spine, and then I turned, determined to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. I started to run, across the overgrown lawn, past the skeletal remains of rose bushes, towards the rusted iron gates that marked the property line. My destination was the nearest town, miles away, but I would walk all night if I had to. I just needed to get away. But as my foot hit the gravel path leading to the gates, a sudden, blinding flash of light erupted from the topmost window of the house. It wasn't lightning. It was a searing, internal glow that pulsed with a malevolent energy, bathing the grounds in a sickly green luminescence. The air around me grew heavy, vibrating with an unseen force. A wave of profound regret washed over me, so intense it brought me to my knees. Regret for ever coming here, for the life I'd abandoned, for every mistake I'd ever made. It wasn't my own regret, not entirely. It was amplified, twisted, fed into me. I belong here, user Ag. I am bound. My blood runs through these stones. The iron gates, moments before within reach, now seemed impossibly distant, shimmering as if viewed through heat haze. The path itself seemed to stretch, lengthen, the distance increasing with every frantic step I took. The trees around me, ancient and gnarled, began to writhe, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. The very ground seemed to resist my stride, pulling at my feet. It wasn't just the house. It was everything. The land, the air, the very fabric of this forgotten corner of the world. It was all a part of it, an extension of its will. The entity wasn't just in the house, it was the house and the land, and it had woven itself into the very essence of my family line, waiting for someone like me, adrift and vulnerable, to return and complete the cycle. I stumbled, falling hard onto the gravel. A laugh, dry and rasping, echoed in my mind, not from outside, but from within me. It tasted of ash and despair. I looked back at the house, no longer a mere structure, but a living, breathing maw. The green glow intensified, and for a fleeting moment I saw not windows but eyes. The trap had closed. I wasn't just within its walls, I was within its grasp. My attempts to sever the connection, to escape, were futile. The malevolent entity, an ancient hunger, had found its new host, its new plaything, and it was going to savor every last drop of my fear. The iron gates, once a beacon of escape, shimmered like heat haze on an endless road. My legs burned, each frantic stride doing nothing but stretch the distance, the path coiling under my feet like a malevolent serpent. The ancient trees, their branches' skeletal fingers, seemed to sway closer, their whispers growing louder, colder. I stumbled, gasping, the air thick and heavy, tasting of damp earth and something acrid, metallic. When I finally collapsed, my chest heaving, the gates were nowhere in sight, just a shifting curtain of gray mist and the oppressive silence of a world that refused to let me go. Defeat tasted bitter like ash, but it was quickly chased by a fierce, desperate surge of defiance. I wouldn't simply lie down and wait to be consumed. I retreated into the house, but not in surrender. If I was trapped, I would know my captor. I started in the dusty study, a room I'd mostly avoided, with its towering shelves of forgotten tomes. Days blurred into a frantic cycle of searching, my fingers gritty with ancient dust, my eyes scanning brittle parchment. I devoured old journals, ledgers, forgotten family histories. Most were mundane, but then, tucked between the dry accounts of harvests and property deeds, I found it. A leather-bound diary, its pages brittle, detailing not just the house's construction, but also its purpose. The faded script spoke of a pact, a binding, a place of convergence. It described the entity not as a ghost, but as something far older, a parasite of emotion, drawn to the deep currents of fear and regret that flowed through generations. It thrived on them, grew stronger. My breath hitched. It was a crude drawing, a map, showing a hidden passage leading from the cellar to an underground tunnel system beneath the property. A system built not just to contain, but perhaps to feed it. A new plan ignited, fueled by a terrifying hope. If the tunnels were part of its domain, perhaps they also held its weakness. Behind a stack of rotting crates, the crude map proved accurate. A section of the stone wall, seamlessly fitted, gave way with a groan, revealing a narrow, lightless opening. The air in the underground tunnel system was a suffocating blanket of damp earth and something else, something cloying and metallic, like old blood. My small lantern cast a pathetic circle of light, barely pushing back the absolute blackness. The walls were rough-hewn stone, slick with moisture, and the floor was uneven, treacherous. Every breath I took echoed, swallowed by the vast, unseen network around me. I tried to focus on the diary's cryptic instructions, on the symbols it mentioned, scrawling them on the damp walls with a piece of chalk I'd brought. I chanted the broken Latin phrases, my voice thin and reedy, trying to project an authority I didn't feel. But the tunnels fought back. I heard it then, a faint, dragging sound, like something being pulled across rough stone just beyond the reach of my light. It wasn't a human sound. It was heavier, slower, accompanied by a wet, sucking noise. They were my voice, my mother's, the friend I'd betrayed years ago. I pressed myself against the slimy wall, the chalk slipping from my numb fingers. My carefully constructed ritual, my desperate incantations, felt utterly useless, pathetic. The entity wasn't just resisting, it was marking me, twisting my own memories into weapons. Back in the house, gasping for breath, I clutched the old rotary phone, my hands shaking so violently I could barely dial. The line was dead. I tried again and again. Nothing. My last thread of connection to the outside world severed. My research, my desperate attempt at a ritual in the underground tunnel system. My plea for outside help all had been futile. The entity had not only thwarted my efforts, but had turned my own vulnerabilities against me. It wasn't just a presence, it was an intelligence playing a cruel, intricate game, and I was losing. The house felt smaller, the walls closing in not physically but psychologically. I was its plaything, trapped, and the game had just become far more personal. The darkest hour, the chalk, a mere stub now, rolled from my fingers and clattered on the damp concrete, echoing with a hollow sound that seemed to mock my every effort. My ritual, meticulously planned, painstakingly drawn, lay shattered around me. The symbols meant to repel, to contain, now felt like open invitations. A suffocating wave of despair washed over me, threatening to buckle my knees, just as it had moments before. I pressed myself against the slimy wall of the underground tunnel system, the cold seeping through my clothes, a small comfort against the searing dread within. My desperate incantations had been utterly useless, pathetic. The entity wasn't just resisting, it was laughing. I could feel it, a vibration in the very air, a silent, cruel mirth that burrowed into the softest parts of my mind. It didn't need to manifest physically to torment me. Its presence was a suffocating blanket, pressing down, making the air thick and heavy. My own reflection in a puddle became a stranger's face, gaunt and wild-eyed, its mouth opening to silently scream my failures. Sleep was a forgotten luxury. Days blurred into nights, marked only by the dwindling light from my failing headlamp and the increasing intensity of the entity's attacks. Not with a voice, but with thoughts that weren't my own, yet felt intimately familiar. They were my deepest regrets, my most shameful moments, amplified and played on an endless loop. Alone, always alone, you push everyone away. The words weren't just in my head, they seemed to scrape against the rough concrete walls, echoing back at me accusing. My body ached. My stomach growled, but the thought of food was repulsive. All I could taste was the metallic tang of fear and the dust of this forgotten place. I stumbled through the labyrinthine passages of the underground tunnel system, my lamp beam a weak, trembling finger probing the inky blackness. Each turn brought no relief, only another stretch of dank, echoing tunnel that felt like it had been specifically designed to trap me. The air grew heavier, thick with a scent I couldn't quite place, damp earth, stale blood, and something else, something cloying and ancient, like rot in a forgotten crypt. Suddenly, a passage I swore I hadn't seen before opened to my left. It was narrower, the ceiling lower, forcing me to crouch. A faint, greenish glow pulsed from within, drawing me forward despite the primal scream of every instinct to flee. I crawled, my hands scraping against rough stone, my breath catching in my throat. The glow intensified, revealing a small, circular chamber. In the center, etched into the floor, was a symbol I recognized from the old journals, the very one that had been defaced, rendered incomplete in the house above. This one, however, was perfect, pristine, humming with that sickly green luminescence. As I stared, the symbol began to pulse faster, and the air around me grew frigid, stealing the warmth from my bones. Then the walls of the chamber seemed to shimmer, to dissolve. I wasn't in the underground tunnel system anymore. I was back in the house, but not my house. It was older, grander, filled with faces I didn't know, yet somehow recognized as my ancestors. Before them, on a stone altar, lay a figure. It was me, my own face, lifeless eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. A jolt, a silent scream that ripped through my phantom self, and then, nothing. The tendril retracted, thicker, pulsing with a terrible energy, and the faces of my ancestors were no longer terrified, but serene, relieved, almost joyous. The vision snapped away, replaced by the rough stone walls of the underground tunnel system. It feeds on life. It consumes. It replaces. The entity didn't want to just torment me. It wanted to empty me out, to take my place, to wear my skin like a ghastly suit. That perfect symbol on the floor of the hidden chamber wasn't for banishment. It was a conduit, a doorway, an invitation for something to enter. I scrambled backward, my mind reeling, my body screaming in protest. The isolation of the underground tunnel system was no longer a refuge from the outside world. It was a meticulously crafted trap, a cage for my soul. I was exhausted, mentally fractured, physically broken. Hope, a fragile thing, had finally shattered. It was here with me waiting. It had won. I was its. The chalk, a mere stub now, rolled from my fingers and clattered on the damp concrete, echoing with a hollow sound that seemed to mock my every effort. A frigid gust, smelling of damp earth and something acrid, swept through the underground tunnel system. It wasn't natural air. It was a breath, a sigh pressing against my skin. The single lantern I'd brought cast long, dancing shadows, making the rough-hewn walls writhe with illusory movement. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, desperate bird trapped in a cage. Not anymore, this was it. The final stand. The air thickened, growing heavy like breathing underwater. They weren't words, not precisely, but a cacophony of my own deepest regrets. The opportunities missed, the harsh words spoken, the lonely nights spent adrift. It fed on these, I knew. It grew stronger with every flicker of self-doubt, every pang of sorrow. I squeezed my eyes shut, trained to block out the insidious mental assault. I am alone, I deserve this. My knees threatened to buckle. I felt my resolve fraying, unraveling like old thread. But then a memory, sharp and sudden, pierced through the haze of despair. Not a memory of my own, but a fragment from the brittle, leather-bound journal I'd found hidden in the house's deepest recesses. A scribbled margin note, almost illegible, beside a diagram of the very symbols I'd just drawn. Not by fear, but by absence. My ancestors, in their desperation, had tried to bind the entity with fear. My own attempt had been no different. I had given it sustenance. The symbols on the damp concrete around me, though broken, still held a faint, almost imperceptible glow in the lantern's meager light. They weren't meant to repel through fear, but to contain through pure, unadulterated will. Devoid of the very emotions it craved. It wasn't about pushing it away, but about denying it entry. My breath hitched. I opened my eyes. It was coming for me, trying to consume my last vestiges of courage. I will not give you fear. The thought was a silent roar in my mind, a defiant spark in the encroaching gloom. I will not give you regret. I knelt, ignoring the sharp bite of concrete against my knees, my hands still stained with chalk dust, pressed flat against the ground, tracing the broken lines of the symbols, not to redraw them, but to connect with them, to channel a different kind of energy. I closed my eyes again, focusing inward, pulling every fractured piece of my being together. I remembered the warmth of sunshine on my face, the scent of rain on dry earth, the simple comfort of a shared laugh. I forced myself to feel these, to cultivate a quiet, stubborn strength that had nothing to do with anger or defiance, but with sheer, unyielding presence. The entity recoiled. I felt it. It was surprised. It didn't understand this. It didn't understand absence. This was the key event. I had to maintain this state. A new wave of assault began, more direct this time. It felt like my very essence was being siphoned away, a slow, agonizing drain. Images flashed behind my eyelids, my ancestral home crumbling into dust, my own reflection distorted and skeletal, the faces of loved ones, contorted in disgust. It was trying to break my resolve, to make me flinch, to make me feel, but I held fast. I focused on the faint, residual glow of the symbols, imagining them as conduits, not for my fear, but for my calm. I poured every ounce of my will into denying it. I pictured the entity, a ravenous beast, clawing at a barrier it couldn't penetrate, its hunger growing into frustration, then into rage. The cavernous space of the underground tunnel system groaned around me. Dust rained from the ceiling. I could hear something scraping, tearing at the stone walls, an unseen struggle against the boundaries of my forced serenity. My head throbbed, a relentless drumbeat against my skull. My muscles screamed with the effort of simply being, of not giving in. Then a high-pitched shriek, not of triumph, but of pure, unadulterated fury and frustration, tore through the tunnels. It was a sound that seemed to shred reality itself, a sound meant to shatter my mind. But I met it with a quiet determination, a deep-seated refusal to break. I held onto the images of warmth, of light, of life, and with them I wove a shield. The air, though still heavy, no longer felt like a crushing weight. I opened my eyes, my body trembling with exhaustion, my mind feeling scoured clean. The lantern still flickered, casting its meager light on the symbols. They were no longer glowing, but they felt different, solidified. The entity was gone, not vanquished, I knew, but pushed back, contained perhaps for a while. I had bought myself time, but at what cost, and for how long could I maintain this delicate, terrifying balance? And I was utterly, irrevocably drained. I knelt, ignoring the sharp bite of concrete against my knees. I closed my eyes again, focusing inward, pushing past the pain, past the fear, past the gnawing hunger that wasn't my own. A coldness seeped into my palms, not the chill of the damp underground tunnel system, but a deeper, parasitic frost that wormed its way up my arms into my chest. It felt like my very essence was being siphoned, but this time I wasn't yielding. This time I was pulling back. I focused on the memory of the light from above, the distant promise of dawn, the stubborn pulse of my own heart refusing to be extinguished. I visualized the symbols, not as lines of dread, but as conduits, drawing the malevolent energy away, redirecting it, containing it. You are alone, you are weak, you are nothing. The entity's voice, a cacophony of my worst thoughts, tried to shatter my resolve. My teeth ground together, a desperate moan escaping my lips. It wanted me to break, to give in, to become the empty vessel it had intended. I pushed back. I imagined the energy flowing not into me, but through me, like a river carving a new path, eroding the foundations of its power. The symbols beneath my hands began to hum, a low, resonant thrumming that vibrated through the concrete, through my bones. Dust rained down from the low ceiling, gritty and suffocating. The very air grew heavy, thick with ozone and the stench of burnt metal, even though there was no fire. A guttural shriek, not from my own throat, but from the very fabric of the underground tunnel system itself, tore through the air. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, a sound that spoke of eons of feeding, of sudden, violent starvation. The ground beneath me bucked, throwing me forward. My head slammed against the rough concrete, stars exploding behind my eyelids. When I opened them, the symbols were glowing, pulsing with an angry, unstable light. Cracks spiderwebbed across the floor, extending from the chalk lines, deep fissures that swallowed the light. The air thinned, becoming difficult to breathe, as if the very oxygen was being consumed. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but it was wounded, retreating into the deepest recesses of the house of the earth. I scrambled backward, my body screaming in protest, my muscles burning. Silence descended, heavier and more profound than any I had ever known. My breath hitched in my throat, each inhale a ragged, painful effort. I pushed myself up, my hands exploring the rough wall, searching for a way out. The air still tasted of ash and decay, but the crushing weight on my mind had lessened. Something smooth and metallic. My heart hammered against my ribs. I fumbled for the lighter in my pocket, my fingers clumsy. I held it aloft, revealing a small, tarnished silver locket embedded in a newly formed crack in the wall. It must have been dislodged by the recent tremors. It was old, intricately engraved with a single, looping initial, my own initial. My hands trembled as I carefully opened it. Inside, nestled beneath a clouded piece of glass, was a miniature portrait. A woman with eyes strikingly similar to mine, a faint, melancholic smile on her lips. And on the back of the locket, almost invisible to the naked eye, a tiny, crudely etched symbol, one of the very symbols I had been tracing on the ground. This wasn't just an asterisk ancestral home. The woman in the locket, one of my forebears, had known these rituals, perhaps even helped to bind the entity, or perhaps, like me, he had tried to fight it. The entity hadn't chosen me at random, it had chosen me because of a connection, a resonance. I was part of its history, and it now was part of mine. The reveal wasn't just about the entity, but about the insidious legacy I had inherited. The house above me groaned, a long, drawn-out sigh of structural failure. The air grew thick with the smell of dust and splintered wood. The ground beneath my feet vibrated, a low rumble that escalated into a roar. The ritual had not merely weakened the entity, it had ripped at the very fabric of its prison, and the prison was the house itself. I had to get out. I stumbled through the collapsing tunnels, debris raining down, the roar of the house above growing deafening. I clawed my way through a narrow, unstable passage, feeling the concrete shift and crumble around me. Finally, I saw a sliver of gray light. I pushed through, emerging into the biting morning air, gasping. The house was gone, not just damaged, but utterly, completely leveled. A cloud of dust billowed into the sky, obscuring the pale dawn. Where the grand, decaying structure had stood, there was now only a crater of splintered timber, shattered stone, and a lingering, acrid smoke. The ground was scorched, the earth around the perimeter cracked and dry. I stood there, covered in dust and grime, my body aching, my mind a raw. Exposed nerve. The entity was gone, or at least its physical anchor was. The house, its prison, its feeding ground was no more. But as I looked at my reflection in a shard of broken glass near my feet, I saw something new in my eyes. I had survived, yes, but I was not the same user AG who had arrived here seeking a fresh start. The entity was weakened, perhaps, but its essence, its touch, felt irrevocably woven into the fabric of my own being. The fresh start I had envisioned was dead, replaced by a haunting knowledge, a silent companion that would whisper to me from the corners of my own mind forever.